Have you ever wondered if Christians are meant to still keep the dietary restrictions found in the Old Covenant, found in the Old Testament? Avoiding pork, shellfish, rabbit, and some other very delicious foods, like pulled pork sandwiches? Or do you believe when Christians eat these particular things, we're actually violating God's holy commandments? Now, for the most part, this question has been resolved 2,000 years ago in the biblical text. However, as of today, there is an increasing number of individuals that are starting to think that as believers, we need to keep the dietary restrictions found in the Old Testament. That our devotion, our love for Jesus, is demonstrated when we keep this commandment and other commandments found in the Old Covenant. Today we're going to be looking at this. My name is Pastor Daniel Donahue. This is In Focus, a ministry at La Center Church, and we're going to be walking through a passage that deals directly with this. It is a passage in Acts chapter 10. And this is a very interesting time in the life of the early church. The history of the church up until this point has really consisted of the Jewish world. Yes, the Samaritans were involved in this, but to the Jews, Samaritans were, well, almost Jewish in comparison to Gentiles. Gentiles were truly the unclean among us. While the Samaritans, well, they're kind of like the half, or the in-between Jews and Gentiles. So up until this point, Gentiles, those that are not of the Israelite, not from the tribes of Israel, have been outside of the covenant promises that have been given even into the church. But here the Spirit is working, and we're seeing the Spirit work with a certain Gentile individual by the name of Cornelius, and he sends 3 servants to Peter's house by the prompting of an angel. And now Peter, who is at Simon the tanner's house, is going up to the flat roof to pray around noontime, around mealtime, and he receives a trance. And this particular trance has something very interesting take place because it kind of deals precisely with the question we're talking about today. Whether Gentiles, whether food is considered unclean for Christians today. So in Acts chapter 10, we're going to watch as this particular vision takes place. It's verses 9 through 15. Now, I'm not going to read all of it. He's on the roof, he's praying, he's hungry, they're preparing the meal, and then as he's praying, he falls into a trance. And then he sees, well, heaven open up and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by 4 corners upon the earth. And in it, verse 12, all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air were there, and there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again, a second time, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now for some, this is the only verse they need. They're fully convinced based upon this particular passage that, yeah, we obviously do not have to keep the dietary restrictions. However, there are others that do not actually think that this verse is even speaking about kosher or non-kosher foods. And one of the reasons why is when they get later on in this particular passage, when Peter is actually talking to the Gentiles, Peter says, "But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean." And so they'll say, well, this particular vision, it's more just basically an analogy for Peter that the Gentiles are now unclean, because that's what Peter's commentary is in this particular passage. But not exactly. Because here's the thing. The vision is indicating something grander that is taking place. First, that he is opening up the realm to the Gentiles as well, to anybody who's a God-fearer, to anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord. But the thing is, that dietary restriction was still a divide. The old covenant was still a divide. And if someone prior to this wanted to come to Christianity, they had to become a proselyte into Judaism to then become a Christian. Which there's this massive dividing line where you have to keep the feast days, you have to keep the dietary restrictions, you have to keep Sabbath, you have to get circumcised. But here, none of that is shown. The thing is, God instead removed those requirements because, as the Bible wonderfully states all throughout, God perfectly fulfilled the requirements of the law. He fulfilled the just demands of the law, fulfilling that contract. And so we no longer are under the old covenant and now under the new covenant. And under the new covenant, there's no longer dietary restrictions for us to observe. In this passage, if you were to say, well, he's only speaking of, let's say, the food, of Gentiles, if that's true, well, there's other places we can go to actually find out exactly whether we have to keep kosher or not. As an example, let us go to Corinthians. Paul, he's speaking in Corinthians chapter 10. And listen to these words that he says. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on grounds of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbeliever invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on grounds of conscience. So, this particular passage. What are you supposed to eat? Whatever is set before you without objecting. Eat whatever. Go into the meat market. Don't ask questions. And it's talking about an unbeliever. If an unbeliever basically says, for whatever reason you're there, you're disposed to go, well, how should you approach it? Well, should you basically prevent the gospel of Jesus Christ being presented well because you are holding on to customs that we are no longer under? Or for the sake of the gospel, you eat what is served. And that's clearly what is being stated. Because when we actually get to Galatians, Peter, still wrestling over this particular question, or more so, he actually was no longer wrestling over this question, but others were, and he was giving into peer pressure. Paul had to actually confront him to his face. In verses chapter 2, 11 through 15, it states this, but when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. So he was eating with the Gentiles. What is that in details? In details they were not keeping kosher. How do we know that? Well, let's continue. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, so this has to actually go to the truth of the gospel. That's how important this is. I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like a Jew? So what does that mean? Peter was living like a Gentile. Well, how did Gentiles live? They were not keeping the dietary restrictions that the Jews were. So he's living like a Gentile. And then these that came from the circumcision party basically are trying to convince him to, hey, don't sit with the Gentiles. Don't eat what they're eating. And this is Equally true when we actually go back to 1 Corinthians, again, this time 9, we'll see kind of Paul's understanding of this. For though I am free from all, I've made myself a servant to all, that I might win more. So this all has to do with the gospel. And go back to that original presentation in 1 Corinthians 10 where it says, eat what is ever on your plate. Because why? You want to present the gospel. You don't want to get this dietary restriction to prohibit people from coming to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so what he says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jew, I become as a Jew. So when he's around Jews, he keeps the dietary restrictions in order to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, as I might win those that are under the law. So he puts himself under the law when he's around those that are under the law. To those outside of the law, I become as one outside of the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you understand what the law of Christ is, it's all throughout the New Testament, and that's the law of love. It's the royal law of love found in James. It's spoken about. It's the new commandment that is given to us. A new commandment is given that you love others as I have loved you. That is the commandment. It's all throughout Romans and Galatians and James. It's the royal law of love, or also called the law of Christ. It says, I'm under the law of Christ now, that I might win those outside of the law. To the weak I become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in the blessings. So, if we were still required to keep these dietary restrictions, Paul could not make a statement like this. And why did it go away? Why did these dietary restrictions go away? God, why did they no longer are required under the law, under the new covenant? Well, because they become a burden for the Gentiles to enter into, well, a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's no longer you're saved by faith alone. You are saved by maybe Jesus' blood after you do all these necessary requirements to get there. Now, some will justify that, no, we are just doing this because we love Jesus. Because in John it says, if you love Jesus, you'll keep my commandments. But in context, he's pointing back to the law of love, the one that he was just referring to, the new commandment. And that's why all throughout the New Testament it says the law of love fulfills the just demands of the law. Because that is what we're under, is that command as Christians. So once again, my name is Daniel, and this is In Focus. Certainly glad you guys stopped by. Have a great day.